Picture this. You have just crossed 800 miles of open North Atlantic Ocean, 65 days at sea, storms that nearly killed you twice, 3 men lost overboard, everything you own packed into a longship that smells of salt and old fish, and the particular fear that comes from being very small on a very large ocean. And now you are here. Iceland, 874 AD. You step ashore on black volcanic sand. The ground beneath your feet is not soil, it is hardened lava, broken into jagged fragments that cut through leather soles. The air is cold and sulfurous. Geothermal steam rises from cracks in the earth. In the distance, a glacier sits on top of a volcano like something from a world that has not finished being made yet. You look around for the thing you need most, the thing every piece of building knowledge you own assumes will be available. The thing every longhouse you have ever seen was built from. Trees, there are none. Not a forest, not a grove, not a stand of timber on the hillside you can fell and mill and use. Almost nothing. A few scattered birch trees, stunted, wind-bent, barely taller than a man, clinging to sheltered valleys where the wind cannot reach them directly. Not enough to build a house, not enough to build a boat, not enough to heat a longhouse through a single Icelandic winter. You have 30 people behind you. They need shelter before the first winter storm hits. The first winter storm in Iceland arrives in October. It is currently late August. You have 6 weeks, and you have just realized that everything you know about building is useless here. What do you do? To understand what the Norse settlers faced in Iceland, you need to understand what Iceland actually is. It is not a normal island. Iceland sits directly on the mid-Atlantic ridge, the boundary between the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates. The island is being actively created. Volcanoes erupt regularly, the ground moves, new lava fields appear. Existing ones shift and crack. The landscape is unlike almost anything else on Earth. Black lava fields stretching for miles, hardened into shapes that look like frozen waves, frozen rivers, frozen chaos. In some areas, the lava is so recent that nothing grows on it at all. In others, centuries of weathering have produced a thin soil layer just adequate to support grass and moss. Glaciers covering approximately 10% of the island's surface year-round. Not decorative glaciers, active glaciers that advance and retreat, grinding the volcanic rock into the fine gray sediment that covers the lowland plains. Geothermal activity everywhere. Hot springs, mud pools, steam vents, geysers. The ground in many areas is warm to the touch year-round. In others, just beneath a thin surface crust, superheated water moves through underground channels at temperatures that would boil skin instantly. And the weather. Icelandic weather is not bad in the way Norwegian weather is bad. Norwegian weather is predictable in its unpredictability. You know it will be cold. You can build systems to manage those known threats. Icelandic weather is genuinely chaotic. The intersection of Arctic air masses and Atlantic systems creates conditions that shift from calm to catastrophic. A clear morning can become a whiteout blizzard by midday. A summer afternoon can produce winds strong enough to knock a man from his feet. And through all of this, the volcanoes, the glaciers, the geothermal chaos, the weather, no trees. The Norse settlers who arrived in Iceland between 874 and 930 AD came from a Norway that was heavily forested. Their entire building tradition, their entire material culture, their entire relationship with construction assumed timber, split along the grain with axes, shaped with adzes, joined with wooden pegs, sealed with pine tar. All of it assumed trees, and trees were not here. So they did something that the human species does, with varying degrees of success, whenever the environment refuses to cooperate with its expectations. They adapted. Here is what the archaeological record shows. Within one generation of the first Norse settlement in Iceland, within 20 to 30 years of those first ships landing on black volcanic sand, permanent settlements were established across the island, not temporary camps, not expedient shelters thrown up in desperation and abandoned when something better became available. Permanent structures. Structures that in some cases stood for 300, 400, 500 years. Structures so well adapted to the Icelandic environment that modern Icelandic architects studying traditional building techniques have concluded that the Viking Age turf construction system is still, for the specific conditions of Iceland, superior to many modern alternatives. 1,000 years later, still superior. How? The answer requires understanding something fundamental about what the Norse settlers did when they arrived on that treeless black shore. They did not try to recreate Norway. This is the critical decision, the one that made everything else possible. Every building system that fails in a new environment fails for the same reason. The builders arrive, look at the unfamiliar landscape, and spend their energy trying to reproduce what they knew before. Looking for the familiar materials, trying to force the new environment to behave like the old one. The Norse settlers, or at least enough of them in enough of the right places, did something different. They looked at what Iceland actually had, not what they wished it had, what it had. And what it had, in quantities so vast that it covered the entire island, was grass, turf. The word does not sound impressive. Grass, soil, roots, the material that golf courses are made of, the stuff you cut with a lawnmower, the thing you kick off your boots at the back door. In the hands of Norse settlers who had spent 2 generations adapting to Iceland's treeless reality, turf became one of the most sophisticated building materials in medieval Europe. Here is why. Icelandic turf is not ordinary grass over ordinary soil. The volcanic geology of Iceland produces a specific type of ground, layers of volcanic ash alternating with organic matter, bound together by the root systems of Arctic grass species. When you cut a block of this turf and lift it, what you have in your hands is not just a piece of ground. It is a composite material. The grass roots provide tensile strength, binding the block together so it does not crumble. The volcanic soil provides compressive strength. The organic matter provides insulation. Trapped air pockets create a thermal barrier. It performs comparably to modern mineral wool insulation at a fraction of the weight. And it is self-sealing. Stack turf blocks against each other, and the grass roots on each block's surface begin, within weeks, to grow into the adjacent blocks. Within a single growing season, a turf wall is not a stack of individual blocks. It is a single living organism, continuously strengthening, continuously binding, continuously sealing the gaps that would otherwise allow wind and cold to penetrate. The Norse settlers developed a specific cutting and stacking technique, documented in the archaeological record through tool marks. Blocks cut at specific angles, alternating horizontal and vertical layers, herringbone patterns that directed water away from the wall's core. Internal drainage channels cut into the base of the wall. A wall thickness of between 1 and 2 meters provided thermal mass. The walls of a properly built longhouse maintained an interior temperature 15 to 20 degrees Celsius, warmer than the outside air. In a -20-degree Icelandic winter, that is the difference between survival and death. But the walls were only the beginning. The roof. The roof was not a separate structure placed on top of the walls. It was a continuation of them. Turf layered over a timber frame, timber imported from Norway at enormous expense and effort. Representing some of the most valuable material in Iceland, created a roof that behaved like the walls. Living, self-sealing. A turf roof 10 centimeters thick provides insulation values comparable to 30 centimeters of modern fiberglass batting. In summer, an Icelandic turf longhouse looks like a hill with a door. In winter, that hill is what is keeping the people inside alive. But the timber problem did not go away. Even with turf walls and roofs, the Norse settlers needed wood. For the roof frame, for doors, for furniture, for tools, for ships. And there were almost no trees. So they built a supply chain, across 800 miles of open ocean. The timber trade between Norway and Iceland was one of the most sustained and organized long-distance trade networks in medieval Europe. Norwegian timber was loaded onto cargo vessels called knurrs, wider, deeper, slower than longships, and sailed to Iceland. The timber arrived as a luxury commodity, traded for dried fish, woolen textiles, and other goods that Iceland produced in surplus. The Norse settlers did not solve the timber problem by finding timber. They solved it by deciding which problems actually required timber. That distinction is the engineering insight that kept Iceland habitable. And there was one more material, the one that was everywhere: stone, volcanic basalt. Hard, dense, weather-resistant, and available in quantities so vast they have not been exhausted in 1,000 years. Norse settlers used basalt for foundations, creating a stone base that prevented turf walls from wicking moisture from the ground. For drainage channels, for hearths, for the stone-lined fire trenches that ran the length of the longhouse interior, turf walls, timber frame, stone foundation. 3 materials combined into a building system that outperformed everything else available for 500 years. Here is what the construction system could not prevent: deforestation. The birch trees that had covered perhaps 40% of Iceland when the Norse settlers arrived. The stunted wind-bent trees that were not enough for major construction, but were enough for fuel for small-scale woodworking. For the charcoal production that Viking Age iron smelting required, were gone within 200 years of settlement. Gone, not reduced, not managed, gone. The settlers cut them for fuel. They cleared them for pasture land. Their sheep, the animal that was the economic foundation of Icelandic Norse society, grazed the birch seedlings before they could establish. Each individual decision was rational. Each farmer cutting birch for winter fuel was making the obvious choice. Each farmer clearing birch scrub for grazing was improving his immediate situation. Collectively, they were destroying the only significant tree cover on the island. And with the trees went the topsoil. Icelandic topsoil, thin, volcanic, stabilized by plant root systems, is extraordinarily vulnerable to erosion without vegetative cover. The Norse settlers did not understand this. They had come from Norway, where soil loss was a slow and manageable process. Iceland's volcanic soil is different. Remove the plants, let the sheep graze the regrowth, and the soil begins to move. Wind erosion, water erosion, the volcanic soil lifting and blowing and washing away within decades. Iceland lost between 30 and 50% of its original topsoil cover in the 2 centuries following Norse settlement. Land that had been farmable, not easy to farm, but farmable, became barren. Black lava and gray volcanic sand where grass had grown before. The Norse settlers built one of the most sophisticated treeless construction systems in medieval history. And then they destroyed the marginal biological resources that made the environment even barely hospitable, not through ignorance, but through the application of knowledge that worked somewhere else to a system that could not absorb it. They knew how to farm. They knew how to graze sheep. They did not know that Iceland's ecology was too fragile. By the time the signs were unmistakable, the eroding topsoil, the disappearing scrub, the society was too dependent to change. The turf longhouse that kept them alive was built from the same ground that their farming was slowly destroying. They were consuming their shelter material and their farming base simultaneously, and they could not stop, because stopping meant starving. And starving was worse than the slow degradation of the environment, so they kept going, and the land kept eroding, and they adapted to the degraded land, building smaller farms, moving to marginal land when prime land gave out, developing ever more efficient systems for survival. They survived. But the Iceland they survived in by 1200 AD was not the Iceland their great-grandparents arrived in. It was poorer, harder, less forgiving, and it was, in significant part, a landscape they had made themselves. In 1974, exactly 1100 years after the first Norse settlers landed on Iceland's black volcanic shores, the Icelandic government began a project. The Soil Conservation Service of Iceland began systematic revegetation of the eroded landscape to address one of the most severe land degradation problems in Europe. The technique they used to stabilize eroding soil and begin rebuilding the vegetative cover that the Norse settlers had destroyed. Grass. The same Arctic grass whose root systems had bound volcanic soil into turf blocks 1,000 years earlier. The only reliable construction material available. Planted by hand, by machine, by aerial seeding over terrain too rough for vehicles. Square kilometer by square kilometer across the eroded highlands. The project is ongoing. It will take generations to complete, but it is working. The grass is returning. The soil is stabilizing. The land the settlers built civilization on is being rebuilt, using the same biological principles. Grass roots binding volcanic soil, a material that strengthens as it grows. Think about that arc. 874 AD. A Norse settler steps onto black sand and realizes everything he knows about building is useless here. He looks at the landscape and sees not what is missing, but what is present. The grass, the stone. He cuts a block of turf. 1974 AD. A government scientist steps onto an eroded highland. He holds a handful of grass seed and understands this is his material. 1100 years, the same material, the same principle. Work with what is here, not what you wish was here. What is here? The turf longhouses are gone. The imported timber rotted long ago. But the principle, willingness to look at an impossible environment, is still here, still working. In Iceland, you can still find turf houses, not ruins. Working structures maintained and inhabited, built in the Viking Age tradition, still standing, still built from the same black volcanic ground. It was enough. It is still enough. It will be enough for 1,000 years more. Because grass grows, and roots bind, and the things built from what is actually here are the things that last.